In her new memoir, 107 Days, Kamala Harris delivers a candid post-mortem of her failed 2024 presidential campaign. She blames her defeat on President Biden's unwavering support for Israel during the Gaza war, arguing it alienated key voters. Harris describes how the administration's stance became a political anchor, especially among young voters, Arab Americans, and progressives. The book reveals deep internal disagreements, with Harris frustrated by the administration's slow response to public outrage over Gaza. 107 Days stands as both a political memoir and a warning about the domestic fallout of foreign policy decisions. In her revealing memoir, Harris exposes a deep and growing rift within the White House, one that would come to define her relationship with the Biden administration and shape the course of her political future. She accuses the Biden administration of effectively giving Prime Minister Netanyahu a blank check in Gaza, allowing Israel to act with little restraint or oversight from its closest ally. Harris argues that this policy was not only a moral and strategic blunder, but also a grave miscalculation that fueled global outrage and intensified perceptions of U.S. complicity, as harrowing images of destruction in Gaza dominated international headlines and social media feeds. She recounts warning her closest advisors that the administration's unwavering support for Israel was alienating core Democratic constituencies, especially young voters, progressives, and Arab Americans who felt betrayed by the White House's stance. On the campaign trail in places like Dearborn, Michigan, Harris encountered palpable anger and a sense of deep betrayal from communities that had once been among her most loyal supporters, making her path forward even more challenging. Behind closed doors, Harris pushed for stricter conditions on U.S. aid to Israel, advocating for accountability and humanitarian safeguards. But her efforts were repeatedly overruled by senior officials and the president himself. The book details her mounting frustration and sense of isolation as she was forced to publicly defend a policy she fundamentally disagreed with, even as it clashed with her own values and political instincts. For Harris, the blank check policy didn't just damage her campaign, it left her politically isolated and ultimately sealed her fate as a leader caught between principle and power. In her memoir, Harris recounts her private and persistent appeals to President Biden, urging him to recognize the suffering of Gazan civilians and to respond with the same compassion he showed in other global crises. She pressed him to extend the empathy and support he offered to Ukrainians, emphasizing that the pain and loss experienced by families in Gaza was just as real, just as urgent, and just as deserving of attention. Harris describes a stark empathy gap. Biden's passionate advocacy for Ukraine stood in sharp contrast to his noticeably muted response to the devastation in Gaza, leaving her deeply troubled by the administration's inconsistency. This double standard, Harris argues, was not lost on the American public. Voters, activists, and even some within the administration saw the difference, and it eroded the White House's moral authority at home and abroad. On the campaign trail, Harris was confronted by emotional questions from citizens who wanted to know why Gazan lives seemed to matter less to their leaders, and why the administration's empathy appeared selective. For Harris, this was more than a political misstep. It was a profound failure of moral leadership, a moment when the United States could have stood for universal human rights but fell short. She insists that showing genuine empathy for all civilians, regardless of nationality or politics, would have strengthened America's credibility and its standing as a global leader. In the end, Harris concludes, the administration's inability to project that empathy not only fueled public anger and disappointment, but ultimately cost her the election and damaged America's moral reputation. Harris draws a line between supporting Israel's right to self-defense and condemning Netanyahu's military campaign in Gaza. She acknowledges Israel's trauma after October 7th, but criticizes the scale of the response as collective punishment. Harris points to the high civilian death toll and humanitarian crisis as evidence of a flawed strategy. She argues Netanyahu's actions weakened Israel's moral standing and fueled dissent both internationally and within Israel. The lack of a post-war plan, she says, only sowed seeds for future conflict. Harris's critique is that true support for Israel means guiding it toward choices that ensure long-term security and legitimacy. Harris claims Netanyahu actively preferred Trump in the White House, believing he would be a far more accommodating ally than either Biden or herself. According to Harris, Netanyahu saw Trump as someone who would support his policies without question, especially regarding Israel's controversial actions. She argues that Netanyahu viewed Trump as a more compliant partner, someone who would not challenge his government's decisions, unlike the more cautious approach taken by Biden or Harris. Harris points to Netanyahu's aggressive actions in Gaza, which escalated tensions and drew international criticism as a turning point in U.S. Israel relations. She highlights his resistance to U.S. pressure to de-escalate, arguing that this defiance not only strained diplomatic ties but also fueled political unrest at home and abroad. This, Harris says, created a toxic political climate for Democrats, making it difficult to unite their base. Trump's victory, she suggests, was partly the result of Netanyahu's influence on U.S. politics and the deep divisions caused by the Gaza conflict. The backlash over Gaza, Harris contends, became a rallying point for opposition and disillusionment among progressive voters. The war and its aftermath depressed turnout among key Democratic groups, especially young voters and progressives who felt unheard. This lack of enthusiasm, Harris argues, paved the way for Trump's return to the presidency. In her memoir, Harris offers a blunt critique of Biden's unwavering loyalty to Netanyahu, suggesting that this allegiance alienated many Democratic voters. She believes this miscalculation ultimately cost her the presidency, as it undermined trust within the party and among the electorate. Harris contends the administration's failure to balance support for Israel with genuine empathy for Palestinians was a catastrophic error, both morally and politically. 107 Days is her stark, unflinching account of the campaign, offering a behind-the-scenes look at how these foreign policy missteps shaped the election. Through her memoir, Harris argues that the 2024 election's outcome was determined as much by international events as by domestic politics, forever altering the landscape of American leadership.